we're going to get started. We are already streaming live. There will be people on the web who will be watching and listening and learning as well. But I just wanted to take a moment to introduce myself and welcome you all here. My name is Lisa Guernsey, and I'm the director of the Early Education Initiative here at the New America Foundation. And this is a workshop that is a collaboration with the New America Foundation and the Hechinger Institute on Education in the Media, which is led by Richard Colvin. And Richard and I decided to put together this morning of panels and discussion because we both hail from the world of journalism, being newspaper reporters, and see how much it helps reporters to have a moment where they can be in a room where people are kind of helping to connect the dots among three things, really. The economic situation that our country faces right now, the state of education reform, and the way we treat young children in this country from birth through third grade. So we wanted to take a moment here to be able to give you all a sense of some of the experts in this area and some of the big topics that are flying around in conversations among those who grapple with these issues every day. We're going to be moving really quickly today. We have two panels, and then we'll have a moment where we do a presentation of a paper that we are releasing here at the New America Foundation today. So it's breaking news for those of you who might be looking for some of the latest information. And then we're going to have a third panel, and we'll close with lunch, in which we'll have a renowned speaker, Jerry Wiest from Montgomery County Public Schools, will be speaking, and then we'll close the day at that point. So I'm going to turn the podium over now to Richard, and thanks again, Richard, for being with us on this and collaborating in this way. And Richard's going to set the stage for some of the conversations we'll have today and move straight into the first panel. So thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Lisa. Good morning, everyone. At the Hechinger Institute, we started looking at pre-kindergarten and journalism around it a number of years ago, and probably many of you are aware of the advocacy that's gone on to really make the argument that, as Yvonne told me earlier, that preschool is really about learning. It's really not, we think about play before kindergarten, but this is really changing, and so more and more there's thought about how do you make pre-K about learning. But we also know from a lot of research that the gains that get made by particularly low-income kids in the early years, if they have either a really high-quality pre-kindergarten or Head Start over many, many years, that the gains seem to fade, and you've all heard the term fade out. And that actually is a problem. People interpret the research differently, but that concept of fade out is one that public policy people have really latched onto, particularly those who are most concerned about spending money efficiently, effectively, and right now that it's being manifested most immediately in the Republicans' proposal to cut spending immediately, in which they propose a 14% cut for Head Start, based largely on the argument that it's ineffective. So what we all know, of course, because, common sense tells us that learning is not like a one-time thing that happens at a certain age and then it's over and you're, in the same way that you're inoculated against measles or something, that you can't give an inoculation against that's going to, keep kids learning and get them ahead, and then nothing else changes. What we do know, again, as common sense tells us, or if we're parents, we certainly have seen this, is that kids continue to learn, right? And that there's no artificial barrier at which kindergarten that that progression that starts in pre-K and even earlier stops. So what you're seeing around the country is more and more states are trying to figure out how do you knit together the primary grades with what happens in pre-kindergarten and even what happens before that. So, and I think it's so interesting, at least from a journalism perspective, that we compartmentalize this. We think pre-K is over here and then K-12 is over here, and we don't really see it as a continuum. More and more people now are talking about this continuum, and that's kind of part of one of the major themes that we'll talk about, and certainly something that we're going to get into a lot here. So, issues around what does that continuum look like? How does it get driven? What are the professional development implications? What are the funding implications? All of those things are really ripe for examination because all of our, the billions that we're spending on pre-K and early education are not getting us where we want to be in terms of our kids reading proficiently by 3rd grade and then 4th grade and continuing on. So the implications of what happens in these early grades carry over throughout children's education and beyond. So that's really the setup here, and I want to introduce our 4 panelists. We're very lucky. Lisa put together this panel very, very strategically, because each of these people on this on the panel has a different lens into that continuum, if you will. So Yvonne Brandon, all the way to the right, is the superintendent of schools in Richmond, Virginia. She's one of the she's among the growing ranks of those who have come out of the Broad Urban Superintendents Academy. Gail Connolly, sitting to Yvonne's left, is the executive director of the National Association of Elementary School Principals, which is the largest advocacy group around early education in our country. And I should go back. So Yvonne in Richmond is working very much on this knitting together of pre-K and K-12. And Gail's group has a task force which is going to come out with their work and findings a little bit later in the year, and she can talk more about it. But they're also looking at how do we knit these things together. To Gail's left, then, is Sarah Mead. Yes? Checking coordinates. Sarah is a senior associate partner with an organization called Bellwether Education Partners. She writes widely on these issues, brilliantly, actually, I think. And she's looked at, in particular, in this context, she's looked at in great depth the groundbreaking work around the pre-K to 3 continuum in New Jersey. And so she's looked at it as a journalist, as a policy analyst, and she follows what's happening across the country. And then finally, Cornelia Grumman, to my immediate right, is the executive director of the First 5 Years Fund. That's an organization that, as the name implies, advocates around policies in the earlier years. She's a former editorial writer, Pulitzer Prize-winning editorial writer for the Chicago Tribune, and she will talk about this from her perspective. So I'd actually like to start with Cornelia, because she can talk a little bit about the earliest years, where she sees current policy and how it connects then to pre-K and beyond. And she'll take just a few minutes to talk about that.
Thank you, Richard. So I'm a former reporter as well, before I defected to the editorial board and before I defected to advocacy. And one of the things that I talk to reporters about now who are K-12 education reporters is that early ed really is part of your beat now. And the reason that it can't be ignored is if you're writing about high school dropouts, if you're writing about turnaround schools or third grade grade level reading by 3rd grade, really what we know now from this incredible raft of new research over the last couple of decades is that early ed plays an essential role in that. And just because the structures that we have to deal with, these school buildings that start at kindergarten, and state laws that say you start at 1st grade or kindergarten, our focus is institutional, or reporters' focus is institutional, when in fact we do need to look at it more as a continuum, and that these early years are absolutely essential. So we know that there is just an enormous amount going on in the brain, especially in the first 3 years. It's the most rapid period of growth. We also know from a seminal study in the 90s, the Hart and Risley study, that in fact the achievement gap, we write about it in terms of it beginning in 3rd grade, because that's when it starts showing up in standardized test scores and the NAEP and all of that. But in fact, that starts showing up as early as 18 months in terms of language acquisition. And now new research shows that you can see the divide starting at 9 months of age. But at 18 months is when you see part of the issue is the number of words that are heard in the home in the early years. And so the study shows that by the age of 4, children of professional parents have heard 32 million more words than children of parents on public assistance. That's astonishing, and that's the ball game right there. And so by the time they get into kindergarten, they are already very delayed, and Gail and Yvonne can talk about what that actually means in terms of class time spent, that kindergarten teachers, they have to spend, not only kindergarten, but beyond 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade teachers have to spend. Richard mentioned fade out. I want to, everybody, that's the first thing they associate it with early ed, and it's hard for people to wrap their heads around that. One of the things that's essential, and it sounds so squishy, and I know as a former reporter I couldn't stand it when I hearing about social emotional growth of kids, but all the studies really are measuring cognitive abilities. That's, do you know your numbers, your colors, your letters? That is only half of the equation. We now know from research that the social emotional skills that are learned, and those are really learned in those first 5 years, are absolutely essential. And those are the ones that do not fade out over time. And this doesn't come from me. This comes from Jim Heckman, Nobel economist at the University of Chicago. But that's the through line. In fact, those have more impact on success later in life, almost have more impact than whether you know your colors and your numbers by kindergarten. So, and when we talk about social emotional skills, we're talking about ability to pay attention, ability to sit in groups, persistence, motivation, all of these skills that we now are seeing are so much more important than we ever knew before. And just in I send my son, he's a 7-year-old in 1st grade, he goes to Chicago public schools and started out in very high poverty public school, where it was such a big part of the early childhood curriculum. And now in his magnet school, he's going to kindergarten through 3rd grade. They have a whole social emotional component of their curriculum that they are really emphasizing in a very, very serious way, because they realize this is a continuum and you need to keep on focusing on these skills for kids to be successful. So anyway, this is why, and there we have. It's hard for reporters to wrap their heads around, because it is this mishmash of a system. People call it a tossed salad or a hodgepodge. It's almost a vouchered system. There's no central system, and that's part of why some of the things that we're working on at the federal level are to create more of a system so you can ensure more quality across the board. You have Head Start, which is a federal to local program. You have state pre-K, which is state to districts. You have child care, which is federal to state. I mean, it's all over the map. And so finding coherence in these systems and getting a handle on them and figuring out ways to write about them is always a challenge for reporters. So yeah. I will stop there.
And I think that concept of coherence that Cornelia just introduced is really an important one, and it means a bunch of different things in this whole discussion, but especially around quality, I think that's a really important point to think about. Now, Sarah, I learned virtually everything I know about pre-K to 3rd by reading the piece that you wrote about New Jersey and about how they had, put these into place. Can you just talk about some of the components of a good, robust pre-K to 3rd system? So what does it look like? And then very briefly, do we have the policy and the financing that supports that kind of approach?
Sure. So just a little bit of background on New Jersey. In the 80s, there was a school finance litigation case that started in New Jersey that ultimately resulted in basically the state Supreme Court saying that New Jersey had to provide full-day pre-K for all 3 and 4-year-olds in 31 very high poverty districts in the state, as well as full day kindergarten. Then ultimately how that was implemented. There were also K-12 reforms, and how that was implemented earlier in the 2000 through 2005 or so, really was focused on pre-K third. So they combined a really intensive quality effort in the preschool programs, which are mostly kids being served in community-based providers that are operating under contracts with the school districts. Really strong efforts to improve quality, raising teacher credentials, implementing high-quality curriculum, lots and lots of sort of quality management and oversight of those providers, and accountability for their quality as well. Within a number of districts, there were some pretty robust instructional reforms in the early years, sort of kindergarten through 3rd grade, really focused heavily on literacy. So they implemented literacy blocks. They put in place a lot of use of data. They did moved from sort of the workshop-based models of professional development to having coaches really working intensively with teachers around these things. And this didn't happen everywhere in New Jersey. I think that's the important point, is that it only happened in districts that had very specific will and commitment to doing this. So I think there's a couple points that are really important here. One is that the pre-K third has become sort of a buzzword in education policy, and I think most of the conversation around it really does tend to focus on these big sort of structural components, like, do you have pre-K? You know, do pre-K teachers have bachelor's degrees? Do you have full day kindergarten? You know, do you have some kind of like system level alignment? But so much of this is actually instructional stuff. It's really getting down into how do you actually change people's practices on the ground, change cultures and value systems within these institutions at a very deep level that goes much beyond where the structural is. And that can be really hard for reporters to get at, because it means you actually need to go out in these institutions and really see what's happening and how people are interacting with each other and what the relationships are. And it's also just very hard to do from a reform perspective. It's much harder to, I mean, it's much easier to put in place structures, even though it's really expensive and difficult, than it is to actually change people's behavior. But ultimately, if you don't get to that level, and it is as much about changing the behaviors and the instructional practices in those elementary school grades, so that people really are using data, they're identifying kids who are falling behind, they're changing instruction based on how kids are faring, as opposed to just being about let's tack pre-K onto this existing system. So I think that's the primary issues to think about there.
That's great. And again, I commend Sarah's paper about New Jersey, because it'll give you a roadmap for looking at what's happening in a bunch of states across the country. Washington State, Georgia, Oklahoma, Minnesota, Hawaii, a lot of different states are really trying to figure out what does the state policy look like that's going to support the kind of approaches that that Sarah points out. And it turns out that it's not all that easy to do this with policy either. There's pushback, and that's why I think it's really important, the work that Gail's organization is doing. We did a piece at Hechinger quite a while ago looking at pre-K, and I was really struck by one of the reporters who went out and reported back from a school, a bunch of schools actually in New York City, that the pre-K program and the elementary school would be in the same building, led by different principals, and they didn't even know their names and didn't even have any thought that the pre-K, what's happening there, might have an impact on what's happening in kindergarten and first grade, and how do you leverage that. So the fact that Gail's group is really trying to look at knitting this together is really, really significant. So can you talk a little bit about the issues that your group is encountering as you work your way through this?
Sure. Thank you. I guess the title for this panel really caught my attention. They all go to elementary school, and I think that's a part of the challenge that we continually face are the structural issues that we've talked about, and the separation that necessarily presupposes that children will come into these elementary schools beginning in kindergarten primarily, and all of a sudden then they will be expected to be on par with their peers, and or those adults in the elementary schools are expected to make up for those any differences in any of those gaps. So it's really about how do we work together to close those achievement gaps for those children, particularly those who have been traditionally underserved, and at the same time create an optimum learning environment so that all children can have the enriched experiences that they all deserve. The complexities of the elementary principal's job, their jobs are enormous. They work on average 70, 80 hours a week, and it's hard to really be that responsible and that accountable for what does or doesn't happen in terms of student achievement within their buildings and within their scope of authority. So what our association has done in recognizing the growing complexities and the challenges that are inherently a part, and a growing challenges that are a part of the principal's everyday roles and responsibilities, we've challenged them to even step beyond, to not only understand the implications of what developmentally appropriate educational experiences look like for children in kindergarten, and many of the schools now have pre-kindergarten, but from pre-kindergarten through grades 3, we've really challenged them to understand their role in making certain that they are steeped in pedagogy and the research that can really help to inform the instructional practices that their teachers are engaged in those classrooms. And one of the ways that we've done this, about a decade ago, we developed, and it's been revised a couple of times since, leading early childhood learning communities, what principals should know and be able to do. And we really, probably before the latest round of real focused attention on the need for this alignment that we've been talking about in this continuum of learning, we were really advocating for this, as I said, over a decade ago, and continue to do so. Most recently, we formed a task force that has engaged in a really cross-discipline approach, where we brought together members of the early childhood community, practitioners in the preschool arena, with practitioners to begin to really address the issues, understand the challenges, and then hopefully come forth with some recommendations for each of the stakeholder groups that can help us chart a new path and levels of understanding where we can bring the practitioners together, those who are in the schools, those who are in the early childhood programs and arena, and bring them together to begin to have a real understanding about how to leverage the resources in support of each and every child to be sure that he or she has that continuum of learning. If we're challenging our principals to kind of look at this through the eyes of the child, he or she doesn't just automatically begin when they come through those doors in kindergarten. They've had a wealth of experiences or not prior to reaching their doors, and so it's imperative that principals leverage their influence, their knowledge, their expertise in ways that can help inform early childhood providers of early childhood programs. And at the same time, we challenge our principals to be open and receptive to learning from their counterparts in those arenas, because we believe that each can inform the other in terms of how to create the best possible learning experience. I think the most important aspect of our work, and as we continue forward, will be to continue to play a leading role in convening, getting the right people in the room, so that we can really begin to come forth with some policy recommendations that hopefully will gain the attention that they deserve in order to be able to secure the resources that we know are in short supply everywhere, but we know that it is absolutely vitally important that elementary principals receive professional development, training, if you will, to help them truly understand the potential for how to create this continuum of learning and how vitally important their role is in helping to affect that kind of environment that we know can help all children not only enter school ready to succeed, but can certainly help them to be sure that they can succeed not only in school but in life, because the research is clear. We have a moral imperative to do all that we can to make certain that we help children at the earliest possible stage be successful.
Well, thanks for that, Gail. I'm glad you mentioned resources, and I want to come back to you and ask you a little sharper question. I'm just throwing out softballs. This is just the first round, and then we'll really play the game. Yvonne, you may be, and with all due respect to the other panelists, Yvonne may be the most important person for all of us to hear from on these issues, because she's trying to take these ideas, these theories, these important ideas, the research, and put it into place. And tell us, just very briefly what you have in place there, and if you would, we're all here. It's a private room. What's said here stays here, so you don't have to pull any punches. But I mean, it is out on the web, but I don't know. But no, I mean, let's be real honest with one another. There are real issues. If this was just easy to do, it would have been done a long time ago.
Absolutely.
And there are resource issues, there's training issues, there's standards issues, there's belief issues, there are a lot of issues. So what do you have in place, and tell us, what are the obstacles that others need to know about that you've successfully or are dealing with?
First of all, thank you for putting this panel together, and good morning to everyone. As we start the journey of school reform, we have to make sure that we look at our earliest learners. In Richmond, we were at one time the second lowest performing school district in the Commonwealth. And that didn't set well with me nor any of my colleagues. So we had to start reforming our district by first looking at the overall culture. Preschool was out here, and K-12 was out here. So one of the initiatives that we put into place was to revise our entire curriculum to include preschool as a part. And so we revised and used the standards, the state standards, as our basis, and we created a curriculum that had spiraling objectives. Those objectives went through 12th grade and went back down to pre-K.
For those of us who are not educators in the room,
Sorry.
What is a spiraling objective?
So, I'm sorry, we get into educational lease, I'm sorry. Some of the basic objectives in preschool that Cornelia talked about: social and emotional development, learning colors, rhyme schemes, having word recognition, alphabetic recognition, being able to look at print. All of those are preschool objectives. Well, when you go to upper grades, those objectives are foundational objectives to everything else that occurs. So it is important to have a preschool curriculum that is both literacy rich and numeracy rich in order to develop those reading and mathematics skills throughout. As you build on those objectives, you change them in each grade level, but you still have that foundation as a part. So throughout the early grades, you're building on skills that would make a child become an avid, skillful reader by 3rd grade. You're building on skills that would have a child to be able to demonstrate numeracy skills by 3rd grade. Well, in 3rd grade, if there's a gap that is determined very early on, then we're able to go back down in our curriculum to pinpoint what objective that 3rd grade teacher will need to reinforce, not as a separate teaching skill, but blended within their skills, so they can make sure they build up that skill deficit to the point where they can now layer on the new knowledge. And that occurs throughout the grade levels all the way up through 12th grade. Our preschool, we have 2 preschool programs in our district. We have Head Start, which is a federally sponsored program, and we have Virginia Preschool Initiative, which is a state-sponsored program. They were working in silos themselves. So in order to break down that silo, we looked at those regulations that were things that they had to do, and we threw everything else out and rebuilt the curriculum and the local regulation and local procedures to address the needs of our youngest learners. Cornelia talked about emotional and social development skills. We know those are the foundational skills for workplace readiness. And our total function is to have students to be able to meet the needs of the workplace and be productive citizens. So we had to go back through and work on all of that within those two silos, making sure that we had highly qualified teachers in both programs, that we had a literacy and numeracy-rich curriculum, that we had professional development opportunities, not only for preschool teachers, but for preschool teachers with first, second, and third grade teachers, fourth and fifth grade teachers, having conversations with our middle school professionals about what preschool teachers are having to face, having conversations with high school teachers about what middle school and elementary and preschool teachers have to face. So that was part of the beginning of the process. And we also knew that the public school arena was not the only place where students were going to preschool. So we developed a program with the help of United Way and pulled in private and parochial and mom and pop shops into an organization called Smart Beginnings. And so that helped us to work with the external providers of preschool and to provide them with opportunities to share with us, for us to share with them, for us to work together, to let them know what we're working on within our curriculum. They could take our curriculum, is on the website. They could work with our teachers. They could ask questions, and helping to help have quality preschool environments across the city. It's been a continuous process, and we're still working on it because we still have other partners who are coming into play. But at least we know that we're making a difference. We also had to help our preschool teachers to understand that we had to blend the science of teaching with the art of teaching. So data became ever more important into the lives of our teachers, and ways to collect data where it's not intrusive, where it's not causing a kid additional stress, that is a part of the instructional program. So it's been a good journey, a very good journey for us.
How many years you've been working at this?
Actively since about 2002, more progressively since 2005.
So if I come to visit, say, a second grade class, what am I going to see that's different now, having done this work, from what I would have seen, or third grade, whatever is most representative? School me on what I'm going to see that's different, what my eyes should be looking for to see if this continuum that you've invested in and worked so hard at, that it's in place.
Well, you wouldn't see whole group instruction, first of all. You're going to see blended groups, flexible groups. I may show my age, but we used to have reading groups in my school when I was in elementary school. And you stayed in that reading group from the first day of school when you were possibly assessed to the last day of school. Well, in our classrooms, you won't see that. You will see teachers making adjustments in their classrooms to make more skill-based groups, but they're flexible groups in a way such that a child may be with one group 1 week or 1 day, and then with another group another day, because in between that time there will be small group settings in order to reinforce those skills where there may be some gaps. So the intervention skills will be in place, and therefore that child will be able to get the immediate attention that they need and move on into another group. And children are different and flexible, so sometimes there may be a small group for a small period of time, and it may extend to after school, and it may extend to before school, but then that child will be able to move into different groups based on a quick and persistent way of assessing the student.
I suddenly don't want to be a third grade teacher. I mean, you know, if you think of a teacher of any grade, of like my job is to teach what third graders need to know. Mm-hmm. That's a real hard job. But what Yvonne is talking about, you have to know everything that comes before. And back to her very good explanation of the spiral, you have to figure out where kids are and help them. I mean, that implies a lot of professional development, right? And
it does.
I think you mentioned that, but it's a big investment.
But we also have embraced some technology that will help pinpoint where those objectives, the gaps are, and help concentrate on those as well. Additionally, we have looked at all of our textbooks and our reading materials, and we threw out those that were not working for us, those that did not include assessment, professional development embedded into the program, and those that did not help us to assess children. And we adopted different reading products and different math products for that purpose.
Right. I'm going to ask one more question and ask each of our other panelists to kind of respond to it from their own perspective, and then we'll open it up to the group. But as was noted, we live in a time when resources to states are very, very difficult. The states collectively have $125 billion in budget deficits going forward, and so every dollar is fought over. And Cornelia, your group advocates at the federal level for supportive policies of early education and beyond, and you understand the connection. How do you position yourself? How do you argue in favor of support across these different funding streams that you mentioned? I mean, you know, how do you make a cohesive argument about what those policies ought to look like when you know each of those constituent groups are just struggling just to get their own piece of the pie?
Right. Well, we try to look both short-term and long-term. You know, one problem is if you're just focused short-term, then you would slit your wrists right now and just give it up. Because short-term, what we're looking at is about 368,000 kids in the next, before September, the end of September, losing either Head Start, early Head Start, or child care services. So if the House bill goes through, it'll be pretty profound, the effect. And Yvonne will be kicking out kids and folks all over the country, and they're, you know, girding for this right now. So that's the short term. But, you know, we try to also look long term, you know, partly because, again, it goes back to the evidence, and it's predicated on there being high quality settings like in Richmond. But that this actually has bearing on not only education test scores and graduation. I'd love to know whether you're seeing that in your third grade and any of your standardized test scores yet, but also in economic prosperity. So that's part of our argument, and the whole return on investment argument that you really can see 7 to 10%, up to 7 to 10% annual returns on investment in terms of, you know, lower special ed referrals, lower grade retention, less high school dropout, higher adult wages, lower crime. All of those things have been pretty well documented by randomized control studies over 40 years. Again, it's predicated on there being high quality interventions. So that's partly what we're really pushing for hard, is that you have to keep this work up, even in hard times. This is cyclical. It'll, you know, things will go back. We're laying the groundwork for the next cycle where there is more attention, but we're encouraged long term, and also some of the things that are happening administratively, and Jeff can talk to this, but administratively are pretty exciting. I mean, the whole idea of introducing competition into Head Start or recompetition, that's a huge idea that's going through now sort of quietly, that's not getting any attention from reporters, but that could be huge. There's competition already in early Head Start, which makes it a very high quality program. It serves only 3% of the eligible kids. But I think if competition is in Head Start, then that can go so far toward raising the quality of that. And then, long term, you get those kinds of economic dividends. The question is, there's a political question of long term. Will the folks who control the juvenile prisons in the state shift their resources, or special ed budgets shift their resources to early ed? I mean, it's sort of putting your money where your mouth is. And coming from Illinois, when I saw we have half the juvenile prison beds are empty in Illinois. Just an astonishing number. And the former governor, who is probably another one who's going to prison soon, tried to actually shut down one or two of those.
Seems like a rite of passage for Illinois.
I know. It's such a great news state. Yeah. And tried to do that, and politically it's very hard to shut down prisons and sort of repurpose the money, but long term it has to be done because you just can't justify all of that. So
yeah. So Sarah, you write about this stuff, you analyze these federal policies. Do you see a supportive environment for making some of the resource shifts, for making the investments that Cornelia talks about? How do you think about these resource questions in this context?
I think if you look at the immediate political environment, you don't see a particularly positive climate either at the states or at the federal level, simply given the partisan realities right now. I do think that is a temporary situation, and that over time we've seen this steady thrust towards increasing investment in this sector. So I don't think that the current situation, which these things are highly volatile, will ultimately derail the overall trend. The bigger issue, though, I think, is that we're in a climate just more generally where the education sector overall needs to think much more clearly about productivity. And the early childhood sector needs to get out ahead of this ball. So much of the conversation about what quality means in early childhood has been focused on inputs and not on outputs. And so those inputs are all things that inherently drive up costs because of how they're measured. And unless we start looking at it not just in terms of inputs, but in a broader productivity sense, how can we actually get more bang for the buck out of the people we have, out of the settings we have? What can we do in terms of how we structure our workforce? It's going to be really hard to ever get to the point where we need to be on early childhood. The other piece of it is that this has to be integrated. Part of the value of integrating the conversation about early childhood in K-12 is that the financing conversation has to be integrated too. The K-12 system needs to become more productive, and one of the benefits of making difficult productivity increases in the K-12 sector should be being able to repurpose some fundings from that sector to pay for some of this stuff on the early childhood side, because we actually do know that there are good internal returns. The 7-to-1 figures Cornelia is talking about, some of that stuff is really hard to recapture because the social benefit of people not being crime victims never actually gets monetized in public budgets. But about 75 cents out of every dollar comes back while kids are in the K-12 system through reduced grade retention, which is really expensive, and through reductions in special ed costs. And so to the extent that you can really link those things together in how we think about financing all this stuff, and integrating pre-K into state school finance systems, which you can do and a number of states do, is a good first step there. But really robustly thinking about how do we integrate the financing for these systems so that we're making good choices. We tend to think about everything in status quo terms and everything about money, so we think about early childhood not in terms of what should we as a portion of our total budgets be spending on kids. We think about, well, what have we historically spent on little kids, and can we afford to spend more or less? And that's not really a smart strategic way to do it. Strategically, we should be thinking about what are the needs of our population in order to educate our students in terms of having a productive future, and then how do we allocate resources accordingly. And if the pot of resources we have doesn't let us do what we think is the most optimal thing, then we need to think about making cuts, but in the sense of that broader picture of what's really the optimal for our kids, and not where are we right now and can we go up or down from there.
Can I just add something very quickly? I do think the point that Sarah made, the early ed field really has to get over to the other side of looking at outputs, and they're just not there yet. And I think that's part of the reason why they really weren't a meaningful part of Race to the Top of Innovation Fund, was because the school reformer types who were designing those, they couldn't get their arms around it, and they couldn't say, well, those are all inputs that you're focusing, BA level teachers and all that. Those are inputs, and we've sort of moved beyond that, and we're focused on outcomes now. And if that's the whole thrust of these things, the 4 assurances, and if you don't have the data to do that, and the early ed field they can't agree on assessments yet. They can't agree on standards. And so those are all sort of issues that slowly they're trying to work on.
And frankly, it's crazy that school reformers are not much more engaged in the early childhood setting because, I do, most of my work is in K-12 reform, and when you're doing work in K-12 reform, you're spending about 90% of your time fighting to change systems that are already in place as opposed to doing the cool stuff that you want to do. And in early childhood, because the system is so nascent, in many respects, if you wanted to really focus on doing it, you could spend a lot less time focusing on fighting an entrenched system that's not working. I mean, you'd still have to do that in some respects, but it would be a different dynamic. And so many of the challenges are the same. How do you ensure quality across diverse providers? How do you build skilled human capital for your workforce? And we don't think about it that way, and it's a real mistake for the school reform community because it could be a way, by engaging in that sector more, to advance an entire education reform agenda across the sphere.
So we've got about 15 minutes left, and I'm going to apologize to Gail because I want to hear hear your questions. We've got about 15 minutes left. So who would like to ask the first question? Please identify yourself and.
Hi, I'm Joe Riddle. I'm the education publisher for a company called Smart Brief. You mentioned that, Sarah, that 75 cents of every dollar comes back in terms of reduced behavior problems and increased test scores. Do you have a citation for that? Or?
I don't have the exact citation. It's a study from Louisiana. You can find it on the PreK Now website. It's by an economist, I believe, Clive Belfield. I think that's right.
Yeah, he's an economist. Was at TC. I think he's at. He's in one of the CUNY schools, I think, as an economist. Clive Belfield, Belfield.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Wagoy Chiguna. I'm with Title I Report and Education Daily. I have a question for Yvonne. Yvonne, you spoke about how you got together with the providers and you're starting to have those conversations about that, and you were working with the outside nonprofit. What federal supports could have been of help using maybe Title I funds? Can you talk a little bit about the federal funds and how those are part of what you were trying to do?
The Title I fund or the Title I coordinators were at the table, as well as the Head Start coordinators around this issue. So we were looking at embracing a different model for using funds rather than putting them in those silos. As I spoke about before, we looked at how can we utilize the funds together to serve the same purpose. And so one of the issues that Gail talked about earlier was, Cornelia talked about earlier, was the development of common definitions for outputs. So we were developing in our area a common definition of what school readiness looked like. And we used data to support that and to develop systems to report that information to the group, as well as to analyze it so that we can determine what we needed to do differently. Another issue that came out of that group is to help people to understand that by high school, when you're dealing with dropouts and you're dealing with low graduation rates, that's too late. So we had to look at reorganizing our thought patterns, reorganizing our resources, reorganizing our policies and procedures to address those early childhood needs that we knew were foundational to success on the other end. I did mention to you that we were the second lowest performing school district in the Commonwealth. Well, I'm proud to say that we are no longer there. And I want to make sure I got that on the web and perfectly clear, that we're no longer there. We have experienced tremendous success. It was a long journey, and we're continuously reflecting and revising and understanding that our journey is not over. a lot of what we've been able to do, especially last year, this school year rather, we opened up 3 preschool centers. And those preschool centers were developed using a combination of Title I, IDEA, local dollars, state dollars, Head Start, all going into the same, for the same purpose of creating an environment for our preschool children. We use IDEA funds because we have inclusive classrooms. You walk into one of the preschool centers, you won't be able to determine what kid is in what category, and that's exactly what we wanted. We wanted to have teachers, preschool teachers together so that they could have professional development, small learning communities and professional learning communities together, because in an elementary school there were at best 2 preschool teachers. They have libraries that are filled with age-appropriate materials, age-appropriate playgrounds, teachers who can work together. They have a planning time in those centers so that they could work together and address needs as they come up. The principal is an elementary principal of a school nearby. We have an administrator in each one of them, an assistant principal, but the principal is a part of that organizational structure such that they don't become disengaged from the process. We use all funding sources for transition environments during the summer as well. So Title I, public dollars, some private dollars, some grants from the local universities, to make sure we have a transition program in the summer to help keep those skills being developed when kids are at a most vulnerable time for having lapses in achievement. So I hope I answered your question.
Can I add something really quickly? Yvonne makes it sound easy, drawing down all these funds. It's actually very hard for a lot of local communities to do this. So, for instance, if you draw down Head Start dollars and child care dollars, if the parent loses their job, they could lose the child care money because you have to be working. So, so then what do? You kick the kid out, or how do you bridge that time between jobs? So it's a very tricky thing, and a lot of folks they don't have the wherewithal to actually either get local waivers, or it's just a challenge.
But we also insert some local dollars to help.
Yeah. So a lot of the effective programs have really figured out ways to weave together existing funding streams to make more effective sort of full day programs, not just 2.5 hours for the most high need kids. And that's a big push in federal policy now, is can you create waivers so that it makes it, you have more flexible funding at the local level.
I would just observe as a reporter that, the old idea that follow the money is really, really important here. So a lot of superintendents, a lot of folks who, superintendents around the country will say, oh yeah, we have this continuum. We think about pre-K to 3. We understand the developmental issues. Well, the way to test that is whether or not you've got a leader who is willing to go through the hard work of figuring out how you knit together all those funds, and whether they're putting in local dollars into that effort. And that's a way to say, if you're serious about it, then you got to move money around, because if you don't, you're not serious.
I would just add that one of the things that can make this hard for reporters to cover this issue is the fact that the funding streams are so different from state to state and from locality to locality, and so it can be really hard to get your head around it because you'll hear something and it doesn't actually apply in the situation you're in. And so if you can take a little bit of time to actually learn what the things in your state are called and a little bit about how they work, it will make your job much easier in the long run.
We've got about 5 more minutes, probably time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, depending on how long they are. Caroline?
Thanks. I'm Carolyn Henry from the Education Writers Association. And I was really interested in, Cornelia, you talking about outcomes and being more attuned to that in the field, and the issue of assessment and how important social and emotional learning is. But I'm wondering to what extent the school readiness measures that districts are putting in place, do they try to measure the social emotional indicators, or is it really being driven by academic measures? And because this issue with assessment and how do you really assess these outcomes that we know are so important for later academic success, are they all focused on, do you know your letters, do you know your numbers, or, is it more, do you know how to play well with other kids and sit still and pay attention and all that kind of thing?
And I'm going to punt that to the experts.
Gail, why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. What I would say is we have serious concern as an organization on behalf of 60,000, 65,000 K-8 principals struggle with that very issue in this era of high-stakes accountability, which we're all have been living with for the past decade or so and for probably forever now. The reality is we're real concerned that there can be the tendency to push down, to the extent that I have a good friend who is a kindergarten teacher in Florida, and I've never seen her more distressed than she's been this year when for the first time she is being forced to test these kindergartners on exactly those academic measures without real regard for the social-emotional learning that is necessarily important for the full-on development. One group comes to mind who I know has conducted some significant research in this area that's actually linking the impact of social-emotional learning on student achievement, and that's the Consortium for Social and Emotional Learning. They have, and they advocate strongly and loudly, and we are a partner with them in that regard, because while we want children to be certainly ready to learn, and we have actually teamed with the High Scope Foundation in years past to create a, quote, readiness approach that takes into account formative assessments in addition to, and portfolio assessments, and ways to really measure those elements that are not directly linked to the measures of accountability as we know them related to the subject area, for example. So we share the concern. I believe that we and other organizations are really doing our best to advocate for a fair, objective approach that can, again, look at it through the lens of the child and understand what we need to do to make certain that those children don't only achieve academically, but that they are prepared to be able to live in a world that none of us can really even imagine. And back to the resource question, just briefly, I was reminded of an ad that I saw years ago by the Ad Council. It was pro bono work that was done for an educational group. It was the Forum of Education Leaders, and I'll never forget, this speaks to the point earlier, I'll never forget this visual image. And it was a full-page ad, and on the top part of the ad was an electric chair. On the bottom half was a high chair, and it simply said, pay now or pay later. And I think that really summarizes sort of the challenges that we're facing right now, particularly with this slate of new representatives on Capitol Hill who don't really understand the issues or the seriousness of how important it is not only to invest in all these early programs that are at great risk right now, and we're strong advocates for that, but also I have to say I wish all superintendents were as enlightened, because I think as we look at the whole system, the more superintendents who can be as supportive and as engaged and as mindful of how important it is to engage the whole system and all the players in that system, with principals playing a key role, but also the support and encouragement and the resources they need to be able to be even more effective in not only their roles in the formal grades of schooling from kindergarten or pre-kindergarten through grades 8, our organization, education serves, but also how to help them be able to become strong advocates and spokespeople and influential in the policies that can help support the entire environment going forward. So we appreciate your interest in being here today to help build awareness and gain insight into the challenges that we face as we look at each of our pieces and then try to look at it from a systems approach and think about what we can do to stimulate the kind of change that we know is needed and to get the resources we need to be able to do it well.
All right. Well, we're going to end there. We're pretty much out of time. I think this is a great place to start for these two panels coming up. This is sort of the overview of how do you knit together systems and how do you think about development over a continuum. And the next panel will be about how this plays out in the area of reading, which is so critical to academic success later on in the first 3 years. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa Guernsey.